They were close enough to feel real, and then suddenly distant enough to make you question everything. But what if their silence was never about your worth, and everything you assumed about love, distance, and pulling away was only half the story you were never taught to understand? Welcome to Ghosting Psychology, where we break down the hidden patterns behind emotional distance, sudden silence, and confusing relationship dynamics so you can finally understand what is really happening when someone pulls away and how to stay grounded instead of losing yourself in the process. They pull away the moment things start to feel real, and that is usually what hurts the most, because it rarely begins that way. At first, everything feels warm, effortless, almost magnetic. There is a natural flow between you. Conversations don't feel forced. Their attention feels steady. Their presence feels like something meaningful is quietly forming. And for a while, it feels safe to believe in it. Then, something changes, not in a dramatic way, not in a clear, obvious moment you can point to. It's subtle, almost invisible. But you feel it immediately. The replies take longer, the energy shifts, the emotional closeness that once felt natural starts to feel distant, like someone slowly stepping out of reach while still standing in front of you. And suddenly, you are left in silence trying to figure out where it all went wrong. Your mind starts searching for reasons. Was it something you said? Something you did? Did you come on too strong? Did you care too much? The hardest part is that there is no clear ending, no explanation. Just a gradual withdrawal that leaves you questioning your value in ways you did not expect. You replay moments that once felt meaningful. You look for hidden meanings in their words, in their timing, in their silence. Because when there is no clarity, the mind creates its own, and usually it turns inward. But this is where things need to be understood differently. Because what feels like rejection is not always what it appears to be. Most people rush to conclusions in these moments. They label it as loss of interest, emotional immaturity, or lack of care. And sometimes, yes, that can be true. But in many cases, especially with certain emotional patterns, what you are witnessing is not indifference. It is internal conflict. The truth is, distance does not always begin with the connection breaking. Sometimes it begins the moment the connection becomes real. There is a hidden pattern often seen in avoidant dynamics. When emotional closeness increases, it can activate discomfort rather than comfort. Not because the feelings are fake, but because intimacy itself can feel overwhelming to someone whose system associates closeness with loss of control or emotional pressure. So instead of leaning in, they pull back. Not always because they want to leave, but because something inside them is struggling to stay present. This is why their behavior feels so confusing. One moment there is openness, warmth, and emotional availability. The next, there is distance that feels almost like disappearance. It creates a push and pull dynamic that leaves you trying to interpret something that was never clearly communicated in the first place. And in that gap, you start turning the situation inward. If they cared, they wouldn't pull away, right? But that assumption is where most of the pain deepens. Because emotional withdrawal is not always a reflection of your worth. It is often a reflection of what is happening inside them that has nothing to do with your value. When closeness activates discomfort, the nervous system responds automatically. Space becomes a form of regulation. Distance becomes a way to regain emotional balance. What looks like detachment from the outside can actually be internal overwhelm on the inside. That is why trying to fix it through more effort, more explanation, or more emotional closeness often backfires. Not because connection is wrong, but because timing and capacity matter more than intensity. And here is the part most people struggle to accept. Understanding this does not guarantee a different outcome. It does not give you control over their behavior. What it does give you is clarity. And clarity changes how you carry yourself in the situation. Instead of chasing answers from someone who is not offering them, you begin to step back from self-blame. Instead of interpreting silence as proof of your inadequacy, you start recognizing it as a signal of emotional limitation, not personal failure. This shift is important because without it, the mind stays stuck in loops, replaying conversations, rewriting memories, and trying to solve something that was never fully expressed in the first place. And the deeper layer of this dynamic is even more complicated. Because sometimes what looks like distance is not just withdrawal. It is also a form of unconscious observation, not a calculated test, but a behavioral pattern where space is created and reactions are noticed from afar, not to manipulate, but to understand internal feelings that even they may not fully recognize yet. And this is where most people unintentionally create more distance. The instinct to chase, to fix, to restore what felt good feels like love in the moment. but it can also intensify the very pressure that caused the withdrawal in the first place. Not because effort is wrong, but because emotional pacing becomes misaligned. At its core, this situation is not only about them, it is also about what happens inside you when clarity is missing. Do you abandon yourself in the search for answers? Or do you hold your emotional ground even when the situation feels uncertain? Because real power in these moments does not come from controlling the outcome, it comes from not losing yourself inside it. When you begin to see the pattern clearly, something shifts. The confusion doesn't disappear immediately, but it loses its authority over your self-worth. You stop personalizing every silence. You stop interpreting distance as evidence of inadequacy, and slowly you begin to reclaim emotional balance. This is not about pretending it doesn't hurt. It does. It is about not letting that hurt define your identity. Because what is happening here is not just about connection or distance. It is about emotional dynamics, nervous system responses, and patterns that operate beneath conscious control. And once you understand that, the story changes. Not because they change immediately, but because you do. You stop reacting from fear, you stop chasing clarity from confusion, and you start responding from a more grounded place. And from that place, regardless of what they choose to do next, you are no longer lost in the silence. You are observing it with clarity instead of collapse. And that is where your power actually begins to return. They pick up on everything, even when nothing is said directly. A shift in tone, a change in how often you reach out, the rhythm of your messages, even the emotional energy behind them. It is not that they are ignoring you, it is more that they are observing from a place where they feel less emotionally exposed, and what they are actually sensing goes beyond your words. They are reading your emotional state beneath them. Are you anxious? Are you reaching out in urgency? Are you trying to pull them back in emotionally? Or are you calm, steady, and grounded in yourself? This is where an invisible tension begins to form. Because on your side, everything feels deeply personal. You felt something real, and naturally, you want to protect it, to hold on to it. That reaction is human. There is nothing strange about it. But at the same time, another part of you already knows something important. Chasing in moments like this rarely brings closeness. It usually intensifies distance. And that creates an internal conflict that is exhausting. You sit there with your phone in hand, overthinking every possible message, trying to find the right way to respond, wondering if reaching out shows love or if staying quiet shows strength, trying to balance care with self-respect, expression with restraint. But the uncomfortable truth is this: there is no perfect message that fixes this moment. Because what is happening here is not about wording, it is about emotional positioning. It is about whether you are acting from panic or from self-stability. Here is something most people don't fully realize in real time. You are not only trying to reach them, you are also trying to reach the version of yourself you felt when they were close. That feeling of connection, warmth, and certainty is what your mind is trying to restore. But for the other person, that same space you are trying to close is often where they feel they can finally breathe again and process what they are experiencing internally. So while you are moving toward closeness, they may be stepping into distance for clarity. And that mismatch creates confusion on both sides. This is the turning point most people miss, because when you respond from urgency, from fear of loss, or from emotional overload, the dynamic doesn't stabilize, it tightens. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because intensity without space can feel overwhelming to someone who already struggles with closeness. But when you resist that impulse, when you stop trying to force immediate reassurance and allow space without collapsing into anxiety, something subtle begins to change. Not instantly, not loudly, but perceptibly. Your energy becomes less reactive, less dependent, more centered. And that shift is felt even from a distance. It creates something unfamiliar in the dynamic, emotional safety without pressure. But almost no one reaches this stage because fear usually steps in first. Fear of being forgotten, fear of losing the connection entirely, fear that silence equals the end. And that fear pushes action too early. Yet what you are learning here is not about doing more, it is about doing less from a regulated place. Because there is something important happening underneath their silence that most people never consider. When someone with an avoidant emotional pattern pulls back, it is not always about disinterest. It is often about internal overload. Too much emotional activation at once can create discomfort, even when feelings are real. So distance becomes a form of regulation. Space becomes a way to regain internal balance. From your perspective, it feels like rejection. From theirs, it often feels like stabilization. That difference in perception is where most misunderstandings begin. And in that gap, the mind of the person left waiting tends to fill in the blanks with self-blame, overanalyzing every interaction, rewriting every conversation, searching for the exact moment things changed. But more often than not, there was no single breaking point. There was a threshold, a point where emotional intensity crossed what they could comfortably process in real time. And instead of communicating that directly, they withdrew, not always consciously, not always deliberately, but instinctively. This is why trying harder in the middle of withdrawal often has the opposite effect. What feels like love to you, more messages, more reassurance, more emotional expression, can feel like added pressure to someone who is already internally overwhelmed. It doesn't mean your care is wrong, it means the timing and emotional capacity are misaligned. And that is a crucial distinction, because this situation is not asking you to stop caring. It is asking you to stop abandoning yourself in the process of caring. When you operate from anxiety, every message becomes an attempt to restore certainty. But certainty cannot be forced through urgency. It has to emerge from emotional steadiness on both sides. And here is where everything begins to shift internally. The moment you stop chasing reassurance, you start rebuilding your own emotional stability. You stop interpreting silence as your worth decreasing. You stop equating distance with personal failure. And you start seeing the situation more clearly as a mismatch in emotional processing, not a measurement of your value. That clarity changes your behavior naturally, not into coldness but into grounded presence. And grounded presence does something powerful in relational dynamics. It removes pressure. Without pressure, the other person no longer feels the need to retreat as strongly, not because you are controlling the outcome, but because the emotional environment has changed. But there is another layer to this that most people overlook. When you stop reacting impulsively, you also stop feeding the cycle that intensifies uncertainty. You begin responding, if at all, from calm rather than fear. And that shift is felt, because emotional systems respond more to consistency than intensity. And calm consistency communicates something very different than anxious pursuit. It communicates self-stability, and self-stability changes how distance is interpreted. Not as collapse, but as space. Not as loss, but as pause. And in that space, something else becomes possible: reflection. Not forced reflection, not manipulated reflection, but natural awareness that arises when pressure is removed. However, none of this guarantees a specific outcome. It does not guarantee return, it does not guarantee reconnection, and it does not guarantee clarity from the other side. What it does guarantee is something more important. You no longer lose yourself inside uncertainty, because the real shift is not about controlling their response. It is about no longer being controlled by the fear of it. And that is where your power actually begins to return. What usually gets missed in situations like this is that emotional distance doesn't always follow a simple interest versus disinterest pattern. Human attachment is more like a regulation system than a clear decision. People don't only move toward or away from others based on logic, they also move based on how safe, overwhelmed, or internally balanced they feel in the moment. When someone starts pulling back right as things feel closer, it can be confusing because from the outside it looks like inconsistency, but internally it's often a shift in emotional load. Closeness increases emotional activation. That activation can feel good when it is within a tolerable range, but once it crosses a personal threshold, the nervous system can interpret it as pressure rather than connection. The withdrawal that follows is less about rejecting the person and more about reducing internal intensity. On the other side, the person experiencing the distance often goes into what is basically a threat response. The brain doesn't like uncertainty in connection, so it tries to solve it quickly. That's where overthinking, repeated messaging, checking for signs, and replaying conversations come from. It is an attempt to regain predictability, but the problem is that urgency itself increases emotional intensity, which makes the gap feel even wider. This is why a common cycle forms. One person pulls back to regulate, the other pursues to regulate, and both nervous systems become more activated in opposite directions. The more one chases clarity, the more overwhelmed the other can feel. The more the other withdraws, the more urgent the first becomes. Neither side is necessarily acting from lack of care, they are just regulating discomfort in opposite ways. Another important layer is that silence is rarely a neutral space in relationships where uncertainty exists. The mind fills silence with interpretation. If there is emotional insecurity present, silence tends to be interpreted as rejection first, even when no clear message supports that conclusion. That interpretation then shapes behavior, usually in the form of reaching out for reassurance or trying to restore closeness quickly. But reassurance seeking has a short-term calming effect and a long-term destabilizing effect in these dynamics. It briefly reduces anxiety, but it also keeps the nervous system dependent on external validation. So each time uncertainty appears again, the emotional reaction becomes stronger, not weaker. On the other hand, when someone creates space and doesn't receive pursuit, something different can happen internally. Without constant emotional input, the nervous system gradually settles. That settling is what allows reflection, not forced reflection, but the kind that emerges when pressure decreases. This is why distance sometimes leads to reconsideration, but only when it is not filled with repeated emotional escalation. There is also a misconception that playing it cool is a strategy. It isn't really about strategy. If it is performed, it still carries internal anxiety, and that anxiety usually leaks through in subtle ways like inconsistent communication, passive checking, or emotional spikes after periods of restraint. What actually changes the dynamic is not behavior alone, but the internal state behind it. When someone becomes less reactive internally, their communication naturally becomes more stable externally. That stability tends to feel very different on the receiving end. It removes the sense of pressure or urgency from the interaction. For people who are sensitive to emotional intensity, that can feel like relief rather than distance. But it is also important to stay grounded in something most people don't like hearing. Understanding these patterns does not guarantee that someone will return, change, or become emotionally available. It only helps you stop interpreting every shift as a reflection of your worth. Because one of the deepest traps in these situations is self-referential thinking, the belief that their withdrawal must mean something about your value. In reality, their behavior is often more reflective of their internal capacity for emotional closeness than of your adequacy as a person. At a deeper level, the real shift happens when attention stops being centered entirely on decoding them and starts returning to your own emotional baseline. Not in a dismissive or detached way, but in a stabilizing way. The goal is not to shut off feeling, but to stop letting uncertainty dictate your internal state. When that begins to happen, the dynamic naturally changes regardless of what the other person does, not because you are influencing them directly, but because you are no longer participating in the same cycle of escalation. And without escalation, the emotional environment itself becomes different. What tends to follow is either reconnection under calmer conditions or a gradual fading that is no longer emotionally destabilizing for you. Either way, the key difference is that your sense of self is no longer being built or broken by someone else's proximity. And that is really the core of this entire pattern. Not learning how to get someone to stay or come closer, but learning how to remain internally steady when closeness is uncertain. At its core, everything in this message comes down to one central truth. Uncertainty in connection triggers emotional reactions on both sides, but those reactions don't always mean what we assume they mean. When someone pulls away as things feel closer, it often reflects internal overwhelm, emotional regulation, or discomfort with intensity rather than a simple lack of care. And when the other person reacts with anxiety, overthinking, or pursuit, that response usually comes from fear of loss and a need for clarity, not from doing something wrong. The problem is that both reactions feed each other. One person creates space to feel safe again, while the other fills that space with urgency to restore closeness. This creates a cycle where distance grows not because the connection was meaningless, but because both nervous systems are trying to protect themselves in different ways. What most people misunderstand in this dynamic is that chasing clarity rarely creates it. It usually increases emotional pressure, which can intensify withdrawal. At the same time, silence doesn't automatically mean rejection. It often means the situation has entered a phase where emotions are being processed unevenly. The real turning point is not changing the other person's behavior, but changing your internal response to it. When you stop reacting from panic and begin returning to emotional steadiness, something important shifts. You stop abandoning yourself in the process of trying to hold on to someone else. You stop measuring your worth through their availability, and you stop interpreting every gap in communication as a reflection of your value. From that place, your energy becomes more grounded, not as a strategy, but as a state of stability. And whether the other person comes closer again or not, you are no longer trapped in the cycle of anxiety and pursuit. The final takeaway is simple but powerful. You cannot control how someone else handles closeness, but you can learn to handle uncertainty without losing yourself. And that ability changes everything, not just your relationships, but the way you experience emotional connection as a whole. If this message resonated with you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Ghosting Psychology, and hit the bell icon so you never miss what's coming next. Because what we uncover here changes the way you see emotional distance forever. And if you made it this far, drop the word clarity in the comments so I know you're truly part of this journey and connected with the message.